Side 1, a continuation of chapter 5. Mary was explaining to me that very few people in the world were really able to love. And she explained that love really did require a full understanding of empathy. She explained that empathy really was so involved in a very deep understanding of oneself in relation to other people, and other people's relationship with oneself, that unless one could really begin to move into life in a way that allowed one to feel in a deep way, in a sensitive way, in a way which really was feeling, then there simply would be no understanding of love. And she further explained that many people really did think that they were loving people, when the love that they were understanding themselves to be feeling and showing was built upon a real misconception, because they were simply feeling in a way that centered on themselves. So, for example, if somebody professed to love his family and gave his family all the goods and possessions that he could to provide them with security, and thought this to be love, this in fact was simply a desire to show himself that he was able to give people something which he felt was important. And therefore he was assuring himself of his own importance. And in so doing, he was simply deluding himself. Because as he gave his family this sort of attention, all he was doing really was bolstering up his own ego. And the feeling part of the whole interaction was very shallow. Because had he considered his family in any real and true way, he would have realized that security can only be gained by a real interaction of loving feelings. Love within the whole idea of itself of being bound to goodness and kindness and caring and sharing in a way that gives of oneself rather than gives material goods. Now this to me was a very deep understanding of love that really had to be entered into if I were to feel that I were progressing, or I were progressing in any realistic way. And increasingly, I began to see that certainly this empathy is an understanding of love which goes way beyond a shallow understanding, a shallow explanation, and it really does require one to think of the other person in a way which is very concrete and physical. And things like suffering take on a new meaning, because one understands that if one can really begin to enter into the suffering of another person in a real way, one which is actually allowing oneself to experience a dimension of life which is then very acute. Because one is beginning to understand that suffering happens because people are not interacting with each other in a positive way. And if one begins to interact with the other person in a way that is really loving and beautiful and true, one sees that suffering should not be. Suffering should not exist. Because if each person is giving to the other everything that is good and beautiful in himself, the other person is able to uplift himself by this interaction, and the whole development would be completely positive. Mary assured me that this is the case, and when she suffered on earth and when Jesus suffered on earth, their suffering was not brought about by themselves or their interaction with each other. it was brought about by the negativity of other people. Chapter 6. So having explained all of this to me, I felt that really there was no way in which I could feel that the world was moving in any kind of positive way, because I was seeing so much suffering, so much lack of love, so much selfishness and greed and hatred, so much disbelief in people's ability to love, that this was really very depressing. And I began to understand that God was letting this happen because of the whole idea of free will. And he was allowing people to make the most awful mess of life because they really had to come about things in this way. They had to move into this whole climactic misunderstanding in order to finally decide for themselves that they wished to pull themselves out of this into something much better. And the vision that Jesus and Mary were increasingly supplying me with was showing me that life was able to be much better, and God would finally show people that it could be much better, and that they could bring themselves into an understanding of this which would let them live their lives in a much better way. The way that Mary explained to be the true way. The way that would reveal itself finally as the true way. And the way that would allow those people who chose to enter it to be supplied with a very enlightened understanding of life, which would move them continually into a very clarified perception of life as it should be. And they would find this enlightened perception so beautiful that they would wish with all of their hearts to be here. And Mary explained that this final development of life would begin within my own lifetime. And she also explained that she was asking me if I would help her with a final development of life which would be so beautiful that people would be allowed to enter it in this enlightened way, and it would move them increasingly into this clarified perception so that they could be protected very securely from a dreadful development of life which would erupt very suddenly in the world and would throw the world into total chaos. Mary was explaining that certainly this would be soon. And she was asking me if I would help her in the way that she would explain, so that I would be able to help other people as this event developed. Of course, because I believed very surely in this vision, very surely in the presence of Jesus and Mary, I felt that I was in no way able to refuse this request. And because it was of such magnitude, I felt that to even consider refusing would be a gross insult, a gross imposition of my will on God's will. And as such, I really felt I had to accept. And from that moment, Mary began to explain in great detail exactly what this final plan would involve, and what I myself would be involved in, so that I would understand that I was moving with her in a very deep relationship, which would increasingly let me see very clearly everything that I could do to be able to organize with her a very beautiful final development, which would allow those people who chose to be with it to see very clearly that they could be protected from a massive eruptive outbreak which would hit the world at such speed that people would not be prepared. And further, people would be manipulated into a very desecrated development of life, which would throw the world into a very desecrated way of living, which God would increasingly allow to descend into a sphere which was temporarily outside his orbit. At the same time, in other words, simultaneously, there would be developing a protected arena which would let people move into it very safely if they chose to. Mary was explaining to me in great detail how this protected arena would develop and how I would be able to help people to move into it very easily, very simply, but in a very precise and ordered way. She was also explaining to me that as events in the world did develop, this protected arena would provide people with a way of living which was absolutely organized and simple, and able to give them a physical and spiritual protection which would allow them to be safeguarded from every dreadful calamitous development that was simultaneously hitting the world. She explained, of course, that this would be integrated very completely into a supernatural development, which would become very visible to those people who were enlightened to see it. And so, although it was supernatural, it would be working on a physical plane, and would be within the bounds of normality. People would be able to perceive it as normal if they could earn this enlightenment. And she explained that this enlightenment would be based very completely upon people's ability to love. And she therefore explained that this understanding of love, this real feeling of love, this real empathic appreciation of love was vital. And people were really not achieving it. Chapter 7. So Mary was explaining all these things to me, and Mary was also explaining that if I wished to develop this relationship with her, we needed to be so empathically united that this empathy would allow me to understand exactly how she was thinking and feeling, in a way which related to the whole world development, and in a way which related to her understanding of life and God's understanding of life, and our way of wishing to finally show people that life could return itself to a very beautiful state where there would be no suffering, there would be no pain, there would be no negativity, there would be no desire to live life in a way that was devoid of love, because love would simply be the basic meaning of life. Love would be the way in which people understood life, and love would be the way in which people lived life so fully that life would return to a way of living that was absolutely purified. She explained that if I were to develop this empathic bond with herself, we would need to move so deeply into an understanding of love that love for me would become a really true understanding of everything that I was doing in life, everything that I was understanding to be my own way of living. And I would therefore be moving in a way that was completely bound to love, and to an understanding of love, and to a desire to live my life with a realistic understanding of love that was so bound to her understanding of love, that we would be moving in this bond of love in such a close and united way, that this really would be the way in which I would perceive very clearly everything that she was wishing me to do, and everything that God was wishing me to do. Because she explained that God was so much involved in this final plan, that he was allowing her to integrate it with him in a very beautiful, ordered, precise way. And she explained that as the Mother of God, she had this prerogative. God was allowing her this prerogative. She also explained that if I would accept the task that she was offering to me, I would be moving with them in such a synchronized development that I would increasingly organize together a plan which would be very beautiful and simple and good and true and loving, and would be able to allow people to enter into it in a very simple, ordered, beautiful way, as the world began to enter into a very dismal misunderstanding of life, which would throw it continually into chaos. At this point, I really did feel that the task which she was proposing was a very enormous task, and one which I was in no way equipped for. And yet I also understood that she was explaining to me very simply that this was the task that God wished me to undertake, and this was the task which I would be provided for in a very superlative way, so that there would be no concern as to my ability to develop in the way that they would ask me to, because I would be given much support, much help, much enlightenment, much grace, much understanding of everything that they were asking me to do in a way that made sense, in a way that seemed perfectly real and true and loving. And Mary explained that I would always understand this vision to be totally based upon love, and upon God's desire to show people that love was his meaning, and love was their meaning. And I must admit that this really has been the very cornerstone of my belief, because I do believe totally in love. I do believe absolutely in the reality of love. I have always felt and known that love is the meaning of life, because for me, I really can accept nothing that is indicative of life in any way that is not linked totally with love. For me, love has to be the reality. Love has to be the fundamental appreciation of why I am alive, and why everyone is alive, and why there is life. Otherwise, life for me simply becomes nonsense. So Mary was explaining something to me which seemed very real and true and good, beautiful, promising and hopeful. And she was asking me to be involved in this. And I really felt at this stage that there was no way in which I could refuse, because to refuse her would be a denial of my own belief in reality, my own belief in the truth of life. And at this point in my life, I really did feel that I had to understand my own life to have a meaning, and life itself to have a meaning. And the meaning that Mary was supplying me with seemed so true and realistic and good and sensible and beautiful that I could accept it very readily and simply. So task offered to me by Mary, and I decided that if I could also accept very simply the fact that God would provide me with enough grace, courage, strength and love to develop in the way that He wished, then I had nothing to worry about. So the whole understanding of life that Mary was offering to me was making much sense. And this idea of God giving life so that a momentum of life would build in a very loving way made absolute sense to me. And yet the picture of life that I was seeing was so devoid of this, so apart from this, that I became increasingly aware of the great gulf there was between the vision that Jesus and Mary were offering me and the reality of life that I was seeing. Because as Mary was explaining to me, this way in which people were living life was so devoid of everything that God was wishing to see, that I felt that there really was very little hope for the world. And I just didn't understand how the vision that Jesus and Mary were offering to me would be able to be accepted by people. Mary explained that, of course, this would be very difficult, because people were simply not attuned to this way of thinking. And furthermore, people were not understanding that people who were visionaries were able to give them a perception of life which was very clear and true and real. And as such, there was such value in this perception that if people were able to follow it, they would be moving all the time into a very real understanding of everything that was good and true and beautiful. And God would be seeing this, and God would be understanding that there were people who were moving with Him in this realistic way. And this final development of life would be able to begin fairly rapidly. But Mary was explaining that people were so far away from a true understanding of the supernatural and a true belief in visions and visionary experiences that they were simply playing with them. They were simply exploiting them and using them for their own fantasy. And they were really not entering into a true understanding of what the visions were offering to them. And because of this, the world was simply moving further and further away from any true understanding of life and a supernatural dimension of life. The spiritual dimension of life was becoming increasingly devalued, and life was really losing sight of the truth. This was such a shocking statement that I really felt most demoralized. And I knew that God would really have to provide the world with some very concrete understanding of Himself, if people were to ever accept Him, because I realized that He had become such a myth that there really was no way in which many people were accepting that He was real. Mary explained that God was perfectly aware of this, of course, and this final development would allow people to understand very clearly that God is real, because it would be linked with a physical development which was very visible. She explained this in such detail that although it was quite a spectacular explanation, it was also making much sense to me. And I was understanding also that people who were simple and good and loving would be able to relate to this happening without any problem. Because if you like, their soul would be attuned to it. Their sense of spirituality within them would accept this happening. And they would be able to relate to it in a very physical way, because it would actually be to do with light. Mary also explained that people who were good and loving and kind and simple and sincere would be the people who would be able to see this light, because their vision would be able to tune itself to it very simply, and they would understand it to be very beautiful and from God. They would be enlightened in this because God would give them much grace, and their perception would be, as it were, clarified, so that they would understand quite clearly, not with their reason, but with their heart. Because Mary explained continuously to me that true understanding, true vision, and true enlightenment comes from the heart. And this can only be achieved with love, with the sense of love, with the understanding of love that she was explaining to me. This empathic understanding of love, which is real, which is true, which is not a pretense, which is not a false, synthetic appreciation of love, which really is pretty nonsensical and meaningless. So she was explaining that people in the world who were on this wavelength, as it were, who were tuned to love in a real way, would be able to develop with this final plan and be helped by it, and would be able to move with this very ordered development, which would nevertheless be very simple. And they would be able to protect themselves from the upheaval which would develop within the world. She also explained that God was providing for these people the most beautiful development, which would lead them increasingly into a way of living that was bound absolutely to love and to light and to a true understanding of happiness. Because they would simply be working together in such a simple, beautiful, happy way that this would lead them increasingly into a world which was perfectly beautiful and happy and peaceful and free. And this world would become for them a new world, which was alight with love, alight with God's love and their own love, fusing together in a blend of love which was so harmonious that it would be heaven on earth. Chapter 9. So, the picture became clearer, and the vision became clearer, and the way in which I could see that life was also becoming clearer, in that I could see very simply that the world was moving itself into a very demoralized state. And the political situation, the social situation, the economic and religious situation, and everything that was bound to any kind of organized bureaucratic approach was becoming so confined that it really was not being offered as truth or reality. And people as individuals were becoming mesmerized, and people as individuals were not understanding how they should live their life, and people as individuals were showing very clearly that the philosophy that they mainly possessed was based upon a materialism which was very gross and very shallow and very debased. And I was also understanding that there were very few individuals who seemed to be able to break out of this pattern. Very few individuals were able to make any kind of inroads into a very simple, true philosophy of life in a consistent way. and very few individuals were living their life in a way that was peaceful, free, and happy. Because they were feeling so many constraints upon their life that life was very unhappy for them. Mary explained that this certainly was the case, and this would certainly continue until the event, which she explained to me in great detail, would happen. She explained also that this event would be so sudden that people would be completely unprepared. And she also explained that many things would shortly happen within the world situation, which would throw people into a very confused state, because the political and the economic and the social and the religious spheres would become increasingly unstable. She explained that into this chaotic scene would emerge a type of government which would be centrally controlled and which would be based upon a most autocratic regime which would begin to force countries into it. She further explained that as this happened, many countries would move into this system, and many countries would be deluded to understand that this would benefit them in an economic and a social way. And many people would be led this way. And many people would then begin to realize that this way was so autocratic that it really was allowing them no freedom whatsoever. And they would then further understand that there was no way in which they could lessen their feeling of being encased in this system, because it was controlling every facet of their life in a very dreadful way. She further explained that because people had lost the ability to think for themselves, they would continue to allow themselves to be led this way, into a very demoralized way of living, which would begin to abuse human life and human living in an atrocious development which would escalate into a massive system of controlled warfare. She also explained that simultaneously there would be developing within the world a very clear supernatural development which would show people in a very visible way that there was an alternative to this authoritarian regime, which would allow people to begin to develop their life within a system which was based totally on love. The economic principle behind this system would be one of loving and living and caring and sharing. And this philosophy would be a criterion which was very necessary if people were to enter this new sphere, as Mary explained it to be. She also explained that in order to enter this sphere, people would need much enlightenment, and as such, only certain people would be able to understand. She further explained that her messages within the world were trying to let people see that the spiritual dimension is a reality. And she was trying to also let people understand that this philosophy of loving and living was a necessary one. But she was explaining to me that people were really missing the point of her messages in a very erroneous way. And because of this, they were simply not attuned to spirituality in a real way, and they were not living their life in a way that she deemed to be correct. She further explained that as this dual event occurred, many people who were outside the scope of orthodox religions would be very aware of this supernatural development, because because they would be living their life in a way that was very attuned to it. And so these people would move in the correct way. Whereas many people within the orthodox religious systems, because they were not really entering into spirituality, but were using the religious atmosphere as a prop, would simply become extremely confused and would not be able to assess for themselves the true nature of this supernatural development. Because many orthodox religions were instilling such a sense of fear into people that they would become extremely inhibited. And because of the world situation and the extremely chaotic and eruptive development, they would really become totally confused and mesmerized, and would allow themselves to be duped into a way of living that was not good or true. In other words, they would move along the untrue way, because they were not able to assess for themselves in an individual way. They would rely on other people to lead them, and many would be led the wrong way. Chapter 10. So the vision that Mary was offering me, I understood to be a perfectly beautiful vision, because it was explaining that people would be able to see that God was offering to the world a most beautiful, perfect help, which could let them enter into a relationship with Himself, which would protect them totally from every mistaken development which would enter the world. Mary was explaining that this would happen in a very definite way, and it would happen in such a spectacular way that the beauty of it would become absolutely involved in a final understanding of life as bound to beauty and goodness and truth and love and peace and freedom. Because Mary explained that the people who could move with this final development of life would be lifted into such an enlightened understanding of life that they would be moving continuously into a way of living that was perfectly beautiful and happy. She explained that in order to do this, they would have to reach a level of living that was utterly altruistic, because they would have to organize themselves in such a way that they were giving to each other all the love that they were able to. In other words, Mary was explaining that the people who would work with this final scheme, this final plan of God, would be asked to live life in a perfect way. And she explained that although this certainly was an idealism, it was the idealism that God had created human beings for. Jesus explained this within the whole concept of the Lord's Prayer, and Jesus lived His life to show this, and Mary lived her life to show this. And Mary was explaining to me that really there would be people who could achieve this. She was able to understand this. She was also able to understand that people would be able to achieve it in a very uplifted way. In other words, people would be given much enlightenment and grace and help, and a really simple understanding of truth. Because she explained that this supernatural development, which would be very visible and would be linked with light and energy, would be so much understood as God's power, God's spirit of life, that people moving with it would simply be encased in it. The spirit of love and light and peace would finally envelop these people, flow through these people, be with these people so holistically that they would be able to move together in a harmonious development that was letting their spirituality merge with their physiology and their mentality in a way that was very integrated. In other words, people would unite in body and soul, integrate in body and soul, and become whole beings. Mary explained that this really would happen, and she also explained that it would happen within my lifetime. And she explained that I would be able to help people to understand this development. I would be able to explain the visible part of this development. I would be able to offer people a protective scheme which they could enter into if they chose to. And all the time the vision was explaining this protective scheme to me in great detail, so that I would be ready to offer it to people at the appointed time. So, as far as I'm able to explain this tiny part of the vision, I've tried to do so. And I know that many people in the world today feel that they are needing something that will lift us beyond the dreadful, dismal picture that we're seeing. And so I just hope that these people will appreciate that I have pursued this vision because I believe it to be a perfect vision. And I also believe it to be perfectly true and real. And if I were to ignore this vision, I feel that life for me would be so empty, so meaningless, so nonsensical, so depressing, so demoralizing, that I just wouldn't understand at all why I was living my life. So this vision gives me hope. I hope that this vision gives you hope. And I feel that as far as I'm concerned, and as far as Mary is concerned, this vision will become a reality very shortly.